Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, and we're here this week with Jessica Davis, the president of Insight Threat Intelligence. And sanctions have been in the news a lot, as has the notion about declaring the IRGC a terrorist entity. And I figured we'd talk to someone who knows about what this stuff means and why the way things are happening the way they are is happening. So, Jess, I think off the top, one of the most important things we heard this week was this 76 million for a new sanctions office in global affairs. Explain why that's important for this regime.
Absolutely. So the way I heard it explained on the presser, and we haven't seen a lot of details in writing from the Prime Minister's office since that time, was it was 76 million to enhance Canada's sanctions capacity. That includes a sanctions bureau within Global Affairs Canada. There was also mention of increasing our CMP capabilities, which is really important when it comes to investigating and prosecuting things like sanctions evasion. Now, in terms of what the Sanctions Bureau will do, big open questions. Certainly, I think a few key items would be enhancing sort of legal advice that they're giving to Canadian businesses and entities, creating hopefully better identifying information for the individuals and entities that are sanctioned, because there's been a lot of complaints from the private sector that they're just sort of giving names which are not sufficient to really do proper due diligence. You know, like if somebody gives you Jessica Davis and says sanctions person, that's not that helpful.
Yeah.
Yes. And so those are the kinds of things that we're looking for from the Sanctions Bureau. You know, maybe better guidance, maybe a bit more in-depth identification of other entities that should be sanctioned. So it's not uncommon for sanctioned companies to spin off other companies. So then you have to go and identify them. And so like keeping that up to date and timely are all really important things. We don't know if that's what's going to happen, but those are some items that I think should be included. And on the enforcement side of things, yeah, like Canada has been super underperforming, I would say, in terms of sanctions. In evasion, sanctions enforcement. Most of the enforcement actually comes from the United States, from US law enforcement who identify sanctions evasion activity in Canada, and they take action on that.
Okay, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic because yeah, if we're not able to kind of do our own homework on this, that doesn't say a lot for us internationally, does it?
No, it really doesn't. And it makes everything that we're saying in terms of sanctions just pure words, lip service to the global effort against sanctions, whether we're talking Russia, whether we're talking Iran. What Canada needs is that enforcement capability to actually make our sanctions meaningful in some way. And when I say meaningful, we're still talking middle power, Canadian way, but certainly better than where we are right now.
Right. And with that in mind, there's been a lot of chatter in the last couple of weeks, especially about designating the IRGC a terrorist entity. And we've had some professors who are saying, well, that really wouldn't do anything because that is simply too large and would exceed our capacity to enforce any of these sanctions. I wonder if you can put some of that in context for us.
Yeah, I think there's a real symbolic desire from people, fair enough, to want to have the IRGC designated as a terrorist entity, to be called a terrorist entity into Canadian law. And I get it. That's, it feels meaningful. It feels like that would be something Canada is really taking a strong action against. But in practice, it wouldn't. In practice, first of all, it might not be lawful because there is a carve out for military activity under Canada's Criminal Code terrorist activity definition. It's not actually included. So it might make the listing of that entity unlawful, which, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like Iran and the IRGC is going to challenge that listing in court. But, we should still try to do things that are within the scope of our laws.
Yeah.
We have other sanctions tools, as we've seen this week, and there are more as well. I think part of the reason that people want to see the IRGC list is because they're not actually familiar with the other tools that we have. So the CIMA regulations and CIMA sanctions that are what we have seen so far on Iran, the Special Economic Measures Act, those can be very targeted and very meaningful, basically cut off entities from the Canadian financial system. There's Magnitsky sanctions, which are human rights sanctions. Again, can do something very similar. We saw sanctions under IRPA, the Immigration Refugees Protection Act, prohibiting individuals from entering Canada. Again, very effective in terms of a more precision approach. So in my mind, the idea of listing IRGC as a terrorist entity, they have undoubtedly supported terrorist activity in other countries.
Mhm.
The Deputy Prime Minister was extremely explicit in her denunciation of the IRGC, calling them a terrorist entity, but not going so far as to list them under the criminal code, mostly for, I think, these very technocratic reasons. They're not technically a terrorist group. They're a military force.
Mhm.
The government of Canada has an apolitical process for listing entities under the criminal code, and we do have those other tools available to us, and we should be using them. And to my mind, depending on what we're trying to do, which is shape Iranian behavior, limit their ability to raise money in Canada, these other tools are much more precision instruments. However, the last thing I'll say about sanctions, and you can probably tell that I can go on for quite some time about this issue, is that it kind of doesn't matter.
Okay.
However we list them, however they get sanctioned, and all of these things are sanctions tools, unless we have enforcement. You could say the IRGC is listed under the Criminal Code of Canada, but given our current state of enforcement, it would have almost no meaning.
Yeah.
Thomas, has made the point about capacity in this space. I completely agree with him. But that's true across all of our sanctions. Unless we increase our capacity, none of them are meaningful at all.
So what does increasing capacity look like from an enforcement perspective? I'm guessing you would need some kind of specialized knowledge within the RCMP in order to do the work for that enforcement.
Yeah, there's a number of things that need to happen. I think of sanctions evasion and enforcing sanctions as part of the broader financial crime problem in Canada. It's a lot about moving money and assets into and out of Canada. The things that need to happen to make us better at fighting financial crime are the same things that need to happen in the sanctions space. So the government has promised a financial crimes agency. We have yet to see any kind of blueprint for that. They're really dragging their heels on that. And I think a lot of that really needs to be about centralizing a lot of our capabilities and capacity to fight financial crime, identifying gaps, that kind of thing. You heard the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a beneficial ownership registry in response to a question from the Toronto Star.
Yeah.
And that, again, is another important tool that we don't have in play yet. It's becoming increasingly common standard in the international community to have basically a registry where you can look at a company and say, I can see very clearly who owns and directly benefits from this company. In Canada, we don't have that yet. We don't, there's no way to know who is actually controlling a lot of these assets, which is a really bad situation. And then finally, a lot of it is about trained investigators. And so, yes, while the $76 million that the government has promised to improve our sanctions capacity is important, you don't grow a financial crimes investigator, a sanctions investigator overnight. These are specialized skills. Investigations training takes years. Financial investigations training takes additional time. You have to become familiar with, as I like to describe it, almost an entirely different language, talking about like some very specialized terms and specialized areas of knowledge. So, my concern right now is, yes, the government's made these promises, but where are these people coming from? If they're actually putting together an Iranian sanctions enforcement team, they're cannibalizing that from other teams. So what other things are not being prioritized because we're doing this? All of this is symptomatic of this broader issue in financial crime in Canada.
Okay, and that's really interesting because that's bringing to mind like when we cannibalized all of our other national investigation to focus on religious motivated terrorism, and then all of our organized crime ability just kind of went out the window with that. So I think that's an important point we should be making here.
Yeah, this is a Canadian problem. We just under-resource constantly. And so when you have things like the rise of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, they're taking resources from counter-espionage investigations, organized crime investigations, exactly that. So, we're kind of playing whack-a-mole constantly with our priorities.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you also wonder in terms of, I mean, that also fits in the broader category of RCMP reform because, I mean, when you're
Mhm.
trying to do everything, you can't do anything really well as well. And I think that's another, I think, piece of that particular puzzle as well. So that's,
Yeah, I would
yeah,
agree with that. And this is an organization under tremendous pressure, under tremendous staffing pressures. I fail to see how they're going to be able to do this in a meaningful and effective way, despite the best efforts of, you know, the people who are trying to do this work. The
yeah,
organization is not set up for success right now.
yeah. All right. On that cheery
Fearful.
note, I guess just is there anything else that we should be paying attention to in terms of these conversations that are going on nationally?
Mm, nothing that comes to mind. I think we've covered a lot of it, but to me, these issues, whether we're talking Russia, whether we're talking Iran, whether we're talking like any sort of financial crime issue, I'd like to see the government get beyond this like next shiny thing,
Yeah.
sort of way of doing foreign policy and domestic policy. Much more. We need like long-term investments in these kinds of things to be able to do them properly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
No problem. Happy Thanksgiving.
All right. You too. Thanks.
Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.